Welcome back to Tartan Lullaby. I'm Archie, and tonight there's a long, quiet story waiting for you. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find your pillow. Soften your shoulders. Let the day go. Tartan Lullaby tells slow stories of Scotland. Real places, real years, real people, told gently enough to fall asleep inside. There's no music tonight, and no need to follow every word. If you drift off in the first few minutes, the rest will play on quietly without you. That's how it's meant to be. If these stories are a quiet corner you find yourself returning to, a subscription would mean a great deal, and it helps us keep making them. The artwork you see throughout tonight's story is available as a print in our Etsy shop, if you'd like to bring a little of Scotland onto your walls. When you're ready, close your eyes and we'll begin. Tonight, a question: no Scotland, no Samba, the story of the Scots who helped carry football to Brazil. This is Tartan Lullaby, sleep history from Scotland. Two rivers hold them both. The Clyde, grey and wide, running through Glasgow under a low Scottish sky, rain on the water, a smudge of coal smoke above the yards. The air tastes of iron and wet stone. And somewhere far to the south and west, another river, a broad, slow river under a sky so bright it turns the water white. The Atlantic heat lies across it like a blanket. Steam rises there too, a different steam from different earth. Between those two rivers, a thread of connection, a football, a Clydeside man, a factory in a Rio suburb. The story takes a little time to reach its warmth. Settle in, we have the whole night. Brazil made football the most beautiful thing on earth. Everybody knows that. The question is quieter. Did something of that story begin in a Scottish dye works, on a river most of the world has never heard of? The records suggest it might. We cannot be certain of everything. History rarely lets us be, but we can follow a man from a village near Glasgow to a factory in Rio de Janeiro and watch what happened when he brought a leather ball with him. That is enough for a night like this. Chapter 1: The Dye Works of Busby. The village of Busby sits just south of Glasgow in the valley of the White Cart Water. It is a quiet place now, green hills, a few streets of stone. But in the 1880s, when Thomas Donohoe lived and worked here, Busby was a place of industry. The White Cart gave the village its reason to exist, not just for drinking or washing. The river powered the mills. It fed the dye vats. A textile village without a fast, clean river was a village without a livelihood, and Busby had water in abundance. From the late 1700s, mills had risen along the cart. Cotton mills first, then printworks. By the time Thomas Donohoe was a young man, the printworks on the river employed hundreds. The village had grown with them, street by street, family by family. The Busby printworks produced printed calico, bolts of cotton cloth, plain woven, then fed through the printing process to emerge with color and pattern. Florals, geometrics, the kind of cloth that ended up as a dress, a curtain, a tablecloth, in households across Britain and beyond. The work was skilled, that matters. A print worker was not simply a pair of hands at a loom. He understood dye chemistry, color mixing, the way a fabric takes pigment in different temperatures of water. He could read a failed batch and know what had gone wrong. In the 1880s, the dye vats at Busby ran all day. Deep wooden tubs, chest-high, filled with steaming liquid. The colors were mineral and vegetable and synthetic by turns. Indigo, madder red. The newer coal tar dyes arriving from German chemistry houses, bright and reliable in ways the old plant dyes were not. A worker's hands told you his trade. The dye workers of Busby carried the stains of their craft, blue fingers from an indigo batch, red knuckles from the mordant baths that fixed the color to the cotton. You could read a man's week in his hands. The cart itself ran discolored below the works, pale blue one day, faint rose the next. The outfall of the dye process ran into the river, and the river carried it downstream. Locals knew what color was being printed by the color of the water. That was simply the world they lived in. Thomas Donohoe was born in Busby in January 1863. His father before him had been part of this textile world. The trade was something you grew into as much as you chose it. The printworks were the engine of the village, and the village was the printworks. By the time Thomas married his wife Eliza in 1890, he was an established print worker, a foreman grade or close to it, a man who had spent his adult life learning the chemistry of color, the management of vats, the quality control of a batch run. Skilled, reliable, experienced. That combination of skills had value beyond Scotland. The British textile industry by the 1880s was exporting more than cloth. It was exporting knowledge, machinery, and the men who knew how to run both. The world was industrializing, and Clydeside and its neighbors had templates to sell. But there was something else in Busby in the 1880s, something newer than the printworks and spreading faster than any dye in a vat: football. The game had taken hold in the west of Scotland in the 1870s, and by the 1880s, it was the working man's recreation. It asked for nothing except a field and a ball and enough daylight. It fitted perfectly into the lives of men who worked long hours 6 days a week and needed something for the seventh. You could feel it in the villages along the cart, in Busby and the parishes around it. After the factory whistle went silent on a Saturday, the men gathered, not at the river, on whatever flat ground the village offered. The game was young enough that the rules were still spreading, still being argued over, but the joy of it was already obvious. In these earlier episodes of Tartan Lullaby, we have traced how Scotland gave football much of its early shape. The short passing game, the idea of playing as a unit rather than a mob. Scottish clubs and Scottish players carried that knowledge south and east and across the seas. It was already becoming an export before most people had named it as such. Thomas Donohoe played the game. We do not have the match records of his Busby years, but the game was everywhere in working-class Scotland by then. A man in his 20s, fit from factory work, living in a village thick with the sport. It would have been more remarkable if he had not. Around him the printworks hummed on. The vats, the river, the pattern books, and somewhere in the background A decision was forming that would carry him from the grey Cart Valley to a suburb of Rio de Janeiro, from the rain of Renfrewshire to a heat and a light he had never experienced and could not yet imagine. The world's textile industry was hungry for skilled men. British factories were opening in South America, in Asia, in the Ottoman Empire, in places that needed British machine knowledge and British trade knowledge and British technical supervisors to run the new plant being shipped out from Liverpool and Southampton. One of those new factories was rising on the western edge of Rio de Janeiro. The Companhia Progresso Industrial do Brasil had begun construction in 1889 on land that had been farmland, on the edge of a suburb the locals called Bangu. A full British-style textile factory designed to employ hundreds, to house its workers close by, to run on the model the British industry knew. The factory needed machinery from the great textile machine makers. It needed British management. And it needed foremen who knew dye chemistry, who could manage a production floor, who could set up a print process in a country where no such process had yet run. Men like Thomas Donohoe. Recruitment reached into the textile villages of Scotland and England. Platt Brothers, the great machinery makers of Oldham, were involved in supplying and staffing the new enterprise in Bangu. The names in the early workforce list at the Bangu factory are British, several of them Scottish. In the early 1890s, Thomas and Eliza Donohoe made the decision. They would go. It was not a light choice. Glasgow was home. The Cart Valley was home. Busby was the whole shape of the world he had grown up in. But the work was there, in Brazil, and the terms were good enough. He packed what a foreman packs, clothes for a different climate, though he cannot really have known what that climate meant until he felt it, tools of his trade, and the records suggest a football. A leather football, carried in a bag or perhaps wrapped in a coat across the Atlantic. The kind of thing a man takes because the game is part of who he is, not because he has a plan. He was not carrying a manifesto for football. He was carrying his recreation. In May 1894, Thomas Donohoe arrived in Bangu, Rio de Janeiro. He was 31 years old. The factory was by then in operation, its looms running, its dye process beginning to take shape under British supervision. The suburb of Bangu was being built around it, family by family, just as Busby had been built around its printworks a century before. The heat was a different world. Renfrewshire rain had been the background music of his entire life. Here the light was sharp and white, and the air was thick. The river nearby was slow and brown, and nothing like the cart. The palm trees at the edge of the factory yard would have looked stranger than anything he had imagined. But the factory was familiar. The looms were familiar. The smell of the dye process, that mineral warmth rising from the vats, was the same smell that had filled his working days since boyhood. Inside the factory walls, Thomas Donohoe was on familiar ground. And on the flat ground behind the factory, at the end of a shift, there was room for a game. The records suggest that in August 1894, Thomas Donohoe organized a kickabout in Bangu, not a formal match with referees and linesmen and a published score. a game among the workers of the factory. British men, mostly, a leather ball on South American earth. We should say clearly what we do not know. We do not have a full match report. We do not have a referee's notebook or a fixture card. What we have is the account passed down through Bangu's own football history, through the club that grew from those early games, and through the Donohoe family's testimony. We should also say clearly what another man was doing around the same time in the other great city of Brazil. In Sao Paulo, a young man called Charles Miller had returned from schooling in England with 2 footballs and a set of rules in his bag. Miller was British-Brazilian, the son of a railway engineer. He understood the game and he wanted to organize it properly. In April 1895, Charles Miller arranged a match in Sao Paulo between employees of the gas company and the railway company. It is the first formally documented football match in Brazil. There is a record of the result. There are names. There is a date. Historians point to this as the foundation stone. So here is the honest account, told without a courtroom verdict, because the records do not demand one. Donohoe was in Bangu kicking a ball in 1894. Miller was in Sao Paulo organizing a documented match in 1895. Both things are true, both men mattered. The argument about which is the true first is perhaps the wrong argument. What is not wrong is the romance of it. A Clydeside textile dyer with a football in his bag and dye stains on his hands, arriving in a Rio suburb and playing the game on the earth of South America. That is a true thing. That happened. A thread of the story begins there. The factory in Bangu kept running. The dye vats steamed in the subtropical air. Thomas Donohoe managed the print floor. And the games continued, informal at first, then more regular, then something the Brazilian workers began to join, drawn by the sight of the strange British game on the flat ground after the shift ended. This is where the story becomes Brazilian, and that is the best part of it. Not the Scots arriving with a ball, but what Brazil did with what arrived. The Brazilian workers who watched, then joined, then played, then changed the game into something the Scots had never imagined possible. But that is a later chapter. We begin here in Busby with the rain on the cart and the dye vats and the factory whistle rendered only as steam and blue-stained water, and a young man deciding to go. Let the village settle around you now, the stone streets, the river below the printworks running with the faint color of today's batch, the hills beyond the village, green under a gray sky. The sound of the works is gone. It is Saturday evening. On the flat ground at the edge of the village, a group of men are finishing a game. They do not know they are making history. They are finishing a game. The ball is scuffed. The light is going. Someone's coat has been serving as a goalpost, and someone reclaims it now. One of those men is Thomas Donohoe. He is young and fit and skilled at his trade, and a long way from knowing that his story will one day stand at the edge of the argument about how a country came to love a game more than any other country on earth. He does not know yet about Brazil, about the heat, about the slow brown river, about the factory in Bangu waiting to be run. He is just a man at the end of a game, on a grey Scottish evening, the cart below him and the hills going dark. Rest here for a moment. The cart runs on. The printworks are dark. The village is quiet. This is where the story begins, not on a pitch in Sao Paulo with a proper referee and a scoreline. In a village on the edge of Glasgow with stained hands and a battered ball and a sky full of Scottish cloud. The thread that connects Busby to Brazil is long and faint in places, but it is real, and it begins here in the stillness after the game, with the river running quietly below the works and the hills going dark above. Let the image hold. Two rivers, the cart and the slow Brazilian water, both with steam above them, both running on whether anyone is watching or not. You do not have to follow the thread tonight. Let it rest beside you. Somewhere between those two rivers, the story breathes. It will still be here in the morning. Sleep well. The year is 1889. 5,000 miles south of Busby, on the flat red earth at the edge of a Brazilian mountain valley, men are laying foundations. Brazil has been a republic for less than a fortnight. The old imperial order is gone. In its place, something new is forming. Factories, railways, cotton mills rising on land that not long before grew sugar cane. The city of Rio de Janeiro looks out over Guanabara Bay, white and enormous in the heat haze. 30 kilometers to the west, inland, beyond the forested ridge of the Pedra Branca Massif, a valley opens flat and still. This is Bangu. In 1889, it is barely a settlement. A railway line, a few wooden houses, red dust, and the blue-green wall of the mountains holding everything in. A Brazilian company called Companhia Progresso Industrial do Brasil has just bought this land. The name means what it says, industrial progress. A large cotton textile mill, a dye works, a printworks for calico. To build it, they need machinery. The machinery comes from England, from Platt Brothers of Oldham, Lancashire, one of the great engineering firms of the age. Looms, spinning frames, cylinder printing presses, vats. And with the machinery, they need people, not labourers, specialists, men who know how colour behaves in heat, men who have spent their lives reading cloth. Back in the late Victorian world, there are not many places where those men live. One of them is East Renfrewshire in the south side of Glasgow, Busby. Busby has the printworks, the dye vats, the smell of mordant on stone floors. It has men who have spent years learning to read cloth the way a doctor reads a patient. Platt Brothers know where to find them. In the early 1890s, word goes out through the works districts of industrial Scotland. Work in Brazil, a new factory, hot country, good wages. Most men look at their wives and stay. The mill is what they know. The rain on the Clyde, the fog in the valley, the same whistle at 6 in the morning. Home. But a few consider it, and one of them, a master dyer from Busby named Thomas Donohoe, says yes. We do not know precisely when Thomas first hears the offer. We know he sails from Southampton on the 4th of May, 1894, aboard a steamship called the SS Clyde. He is a master dyer in the calico printing industry. He is leaving East Renfrewshire and everything he has known. The records suggest he travels alone at first, leaving his wife Elizabeth behind in Scotland. The SS Clyde moves south through the Channel. The white cliffs of England slide below the horizon. The water changes colour, grey-green to blue-grey to, south of Biscay, something deeper and warmer. The ship calls at Lisbon, then at Madeira. The coastline there is steep, volcanic, dark against the water, flowers on the quayside, heat already different from anything the Clyde knows. Out past the Canary Islands, the sea broadens out and flattens. The Atlantic here is wide and slow. 16 days from Southampton to Rio de Janeiro, more than 2 weeks of open water. For a man from Busby, the crossing is a kind of suspension. The dye works are already behind him. Brazil is not yet real. For 16 days, there is only the ship and the sea. Down in the lower decks, among the emigrants and the lower fare passengers, conditions are plain. A bunk in a dormitory, the smell of salt water and coal smoke, heat building as the ship crosses the equator. The equator itself, no ceremony in the records, but every man who crosses it for the first time notices the moment the stars begin to shift. By the time the ship is south of the line, the plough has gone from the sky entirely. On deck at night, the sky is new. The Milky Way hangs like spilled flour above the mainmast. The Southern Cross, low in the south, tilted, unlike anything in Scottish memory. Sailors have crossed this water for centuries. For a dyer from Busby in 1894, it is the sky of another world. Thomas Donohoe arrives in Rio de Janeiro on the 21st of May, 1894. The bay comes first, a wide bowl of blue water encircled by peaks. Then the city, white and pink and green, running up against the rock. He would have stepped ashore into the noise and heat of a Brazilian port. Carts, colour, the smell of coffee and salt water and warm wood. The light is different here, whiter, harder. But Thomas is not going to the city. He is going to Bangu. The railway line of the Dom Pedro II runs west from the central station, out through the suburbs and into the flat inland basin. An hour on the train, perhaps a little more. The city thins and drops away, then the suburbs, then the plain opens up, red earth under clear sky, scattered palms, low scrub, the mountains of the Pedra Branca Massif rising to the south, dark with forest, immovable. The train pulls into Bangu station. Thomas steps down onto red dust. This is the valley, flat and open, with the mountain wall pressing in from the south and east. The air is still and warm, even in May, which is autumn here. The light has a weight to it. The factory is close to the station. That was the plan from the start. A mill town, purpose-built, European in its logic, if not its landscape. The Campania Progresso Industrial opened its main spinning and weaving blocks in March 1893. By the time Thomas arrives, it has been running for over a year. The machines are already turning. The factory is large by any standard. Brick built, with the long horizontal lines of a Lancashire or Renfrewshire industrial building, but set against a backdrop of tropical forest and red hills. Around the factory, a company town is taking shape. Workers' houses in neat rows, yards, gardens, streets being laid out. The company is building the neighborhood as deliberately as it has built the mill. The soil underfoot is red, not the dark brown of Scottish farmland. Red, the red of iron, of rust, of brick dust. It stains boots and trouser cuffs. It turns to paste in the rain and cracks hard in the sun. For a man from Busby, where the earth is grey-brown and the rain comes horizontal, and the sky is the colour of old pewter, this red ground is the first thing he would notice. And the heat, Bangu sits in a basin hemmed in by its mountains. The sea breeze that softens coastal Rio does not reach this far inland. By midday, the air barely moves. Thomas is a dyer, he knows heat. The vats at Busby are scalding, but this is a different heat. It does not come from a furnace. It comes from the sky and the ground and the still air, and it does not go away at the end of the shift. He begins work at the dye works. His title is foreman. The machinery is Platt Brothers equipment. In that sense, this is familiar. Cylinder presses, vat frames, the chemistry of mordants and fixing agents. But the cotton here is Brazilian cotton from the northeast and from Sao Paulo state. The humidity is different. The light on the fabric is different. He is learning his trade again in a different country. The other British workers are mostly English, from Lancashire, from the same Platt Brothers supply chain. There are Brazilians too, men from the city and from the countryside, learning the machines alongside the Europeans. In the evenings, the British workers gather. The company has a garden. There is English grass, it is said, brought for the garden by the company itself, planted in the red earth and kept green. The mountains catch the last of the sun first. The valley falls into shadow while the sky above is still bright. Then the stars come out. That unfamiliar sky again, the Southern Cross, the dense spray of the Milky Way over the dark ridge of Pedra Branca. Homesickness is a quiet thing. It does not announce itself. It sits in the smell of rain on warm stone, which is not the smell of rain in Scotland. It sits in the wrong stars. Thomas writes to his wife Elizabeth back in Busby. We can only imagine what those letters say. The heat, the red ground, the factory which is good, which is familiar, the work going well. And in one of those letters, the records suggest a request. Bring a football. Or perhaps Elizabeth, who knows her husband, packs it herself when she follows him to Brazil later that same year, 1894. A leather football worn at the seams, a pair of boots. It is described in some accounts as a care package, a parcel of home. We cannot say for certain whether it was in a trunk she carried or sent ahead. The records do not specify. What the records do suggest is that the ball came from Scotland, that Elizabeth brought it or sent it at Thomas's request, that it crossed the Atlantic in much the same way he had, south past the Canaries, past the equator, under that new sky. It was not a grand gesture. It was a small one. A man away from home, missing a game he loved, asking someone who loved him to send the one thing that might make Sunday feel like Sunday. And so a leather football from Busby, East Renfrewshire, comes to rest in a company town in the western suburbs of Rio de Janeiro. In a valley of red earth, under the shadow of a forested massif, beside a railway line and a textile mill. Brazil does not know what to make of it yet, but it will. The ground is flat here, just beyond the factory wall, red dust and dry grass. The Bangu Athletic Club does not exist yet. There are no stands, no painted lines, no referee's whistle. There is only the open afternoon, the heat pressing down, and Thomas Donohoe looking at the ground, the way a man looks when he is working something out. He has a ball. He carried it from Busby, across the Atlantic, up the river to this place. It is leather and worn and unmistakably from home. His workmates are here too, men from the mills, men who know him, men who have spent the week at the vats and the looms, and now have an afternoon with nothing particular to do. They mark out goals with whatever is to hand: a jacket, a pair of boots, 2 piles of dust that the Brazilian breeze keeps threatening to scatter. It is not Hampton, it is not even a park on a Saturday in Renfrewshire, but the distance between 2 sets of makeshift posts is roughly the distance it needs to be. The year is around 1894. The records are not meticulous about the exact date. History does not always write down the informal things. What the records do suggest is that Donohoe organized a kickabout here, among the British workers at the Companhia Progresso Industrial Factory in Bangu, in the north of Rio de Janeiro. Some of the Brazilian men working at the factory watch from a short distance. The game is unfamiliar. The running is purposeful in a way that seems to mean something, though the meaning is not yet clear. The ball moves between men in a pattern that is almost like conversation. Donohoe plays the way men from Clydeside play: practical, committed, low to the ground, shoulders forward, the kind of football that came from playing on cobbled streets and rough park grass, where you learned quickly not to try anything too clever. It is not beautiful yet. It is just real. The afternoon light in Bangu at this hour comes in at a low angle, long shadows across the red dust. The factory chimney throws its own shadow, a dark stripe over the improvised pitch. The heat is still considerable, but the worst of it has passed. A useful hour for running. There is a moment in any informal game when the people watching stop watching and start wanting to play. Nobody announces it. Someone simply steps forward. The ball finds them. Their foot finds the ball, and something begins that did not exist a minute ago. We do not know the exact score. We do not know the names of every man who played. The documentation is thin in the way that documentation of informal things is always thin. What we have is the account, and the account says, Donohoe, Bangu, around 1894. A ball from Scotland played on Brazilian earth. He is a dyer by trade. His hands are stained with indigo and red, the colors of the cloth the factory produces. He is not a diplomat or a missionary or an explorer. He is a working man who missed the game he grew up with and did something about it. That is the whole story, and it is enough. After the game, the men sit in the shade near the factory wall. The ball rests on the ground between them. Someone has brought water. The conversation is a mixture of English and the Portuguese that the British workers are slowly, imperfectly acquiring. The Brazilian workers who played are there too, in the same shade. There is no ceremony, no speech, no sense that anyone present believes they have done something that will be remembered. They have played football on a Tuesday afternoon or a Saturday. The records do not say which, and now they are resting. The ball in the dust looks ordinary. Most things that matter do. This is what the channel wants to sit with for a moment. Not the debate, not the document, not the question of firsts. Just this. A man from Busby, far from home, in the heat of a Brazilian afternoon, with a worn leather ball and a flat piece of ground, and a handful of men willing to run. Now the honest part, because the history of football in Brazil is not a simple story, and the channel would not do justice to it if we pretended otherwise. There is another man, there is another city, there is a different kind of first, and it belongs to him, and it is also real. His name is Charles Miller. He was born in Sao Paulo in 1874, the son of a Scottish father and a Brazilian mother. At 9 years old, he was sent to school in Southampton, England, where he learned the game properly. Rules, positions, the formal structure of football as it was being codified in those years. In 1894, Miller sailed back to Brazil. He brought 2 footballs in his luggage and a copy of the Southampton Football Club rulebook. He brought the game home in a different sense, not as a memory or a habit carried across an ocean, but as a documented, intentional project. In April 1895, in Sao Paulo, Charles Miller organized what the record books describe as the first formal football match in Brazil. The teams were drawn from the Sao Paulo Railway and the Gas Company. There were proper rules, a proper pitch, a referee. It was the kind of event that gets written down. And it was written down. The Sao Paulo newspapers covered it. The date is known. The score is known. The names of some of the players are known. This is why Charles Miller is the man most often described as the father of Brazilian football, and it is not an unfair description. The evidence supports it. So here is where the gentle dispute lies. Donohoe in Bangu, around 1894, an informal kickabout, documented in later accounts and local memory. Miller in Sao Paulo, 1895, a formal organized match, documented at the time. 2 men, 2 cities, 2 kinds of beginning. Historians have been arguing the point warmly for decades. The argument is worth having because it is genuinely unresolved. Bangu supporters point to the earlier date and the local tradition and the factory workers who carried the game into their community from the very first kick. Miller supporters point to the formal record, the proper match, the organizational legacy that followed. Both things can be true. History is not always a single thread. It is more often several threads running in parallel, crossing and doubling back, and the question of which thread to call the main one depends partly on what you think matters most. documentation, date, continuity, community. The historians are not wrong to disagree. The channel's view, offered without insistence, is this: perhaps the question of who was first is the least interesting question available. The interesting question is how the game arrived and why it stayed. And on that question, both men have something essential to contribute. Charles Miller gave Brazilian football its formal beginning, its rules, its first recorded match, the infrastructure of the game as it was understood in England in the 1890s. That is a real and lasting contribution. The game in Brazil has his fingerprints on its early institutions. That is not nothing. That is considerable. Thomas Donohoe gave it something harder to measure. He gave it an early, informal, human moment. A ball appearing among working men on a patch of ground beside a factory. No rulebook required, no newspaper to cover it. Just the game, arriving the way it so often arrives, in the hands of someone who simply brought it. Bangu Athletic Club, founded in 1904, traces its roots to those early factory kickabouts. The workers' tradition persisted. It grew into something. The club still exists today. That continuity from the red dust of 1894 to a living football institution is not something to pass over lightly. Roots matter even when they are informal ones. There is a texture to the Donohoe story that the Miller story does not quite have, and it is not a criticism of Miller to say so. It is simply a different kind of texture. Miller was educated in England, immersed in the formal game, intentional about bringing it home. He knew what he was doing and did it well. Donohoe was a dyer from Busby. He worked with his hands. He was far from home and he missed football and he had a ball. The difference in texture is the difference between a project and a habit, between intention and instinct. Both matter. The game needed both kinds of beginning to become what it became. It is worth pausing on Bangu itself. This is not Sao Paulo, not the prosperous southern city that was already connected to Europe by trade and migration and cultural exchange. Bangu is in the north of Rio, a factory district, a working community. The game arrived there not through the educated classes, but through the labor migration. The men in the Campania Progresso industrial factory came from Britain because the factory needed their textile expertise. They brought the game not as a gift or a lesson, but simply as themselves, as what they did on a free afternoon. That is a particular kind of cultural transmission. Quiet, unannounced, entirely unself-conscious. And the Brazilian workers who watched, who stepped forward, who put their feet to the ball in those early sessions, they are part of this story too. Their names are mostly lost. The historical record is thin at this end of the social scale, as it always is. But they were there, and the game did not take root without them. There is a version of this story that treats Brazil as a passive recipient and Scotland as the active giver. The channel rejects that version. What happened in Bangu and in Sao Paulo and in the decades that followed was not one culture giving another a gift. It was more complicated and more interesting than that. Football arrived in Brazil the way many things arrive in the world, through contact, through migration, through informal exchange, through working men sharing a patch of ground. What happened next, what Brazil did with the game, that was entirely its own work. The beauty that came later was not imported, it was grown. But we are not in the later decades yet. We are still in 1894, in the afternoon, in the red dust of Bangu. Thomas Donohoe is collecting the ball from the far end of the improvised pitch. The sun is lower now. The factory chimney throws a longer shadow. The game is over for today. He holds the ball under his arm the way men from Clydeside hold footballs, slightly too tightly, the habitual grip of someone who grew up having to hold on to things. He looks at the ground where they played, and then at the men around him, and there is nothing in his expression that suggests he knows what he has started. He does not know, how could he? He is a working man in a foreign city who has just had a game of football. He will go home, wash the dust from his boots, eat his dinner. Tomorrow the dye vats will need tending. The looms will need running. The ball will wait in whatever corner of his lodgings he keeps it. This is the part of history that the documents rarely capture, not the moment of consequence, but the ordinary moment that preceded it, the man who did not know he mattered, the afternoon that did not feel like history, the ball in the corner of the room, waiting for next time, unaware of its own significance. The records suggest it happened. The local tradition holds it. The football historians who have looked closely at Bangu believe that something real began here, around 1894, on a flat piece of ground beside a textile factory, with a leather ball from Scotland and a Busby man who simply could not stop playing the game. That is what the channel wants you to hold, not a declaration of victory in a debate, not a certificate of paternity, just the image, Donohoe and the ball and the red dust and the afternoon. A Scottish habit carried 10,000 kilometers, meeting a Brazilian afternoon. The beginning of something neither side could yet imagine. And Charles Miller, in Sao Paulo the following year, with his rulebook and his two balls and his formal match between the railway men and the gas workers. He is part of this too. He is not the rival of the Donohoe story. He is the companion to it. Brazil was large enough for both beginnings. The historians will continue the argument. It is a good argument, conducted mostly in good faith, about a question that genuinely does not have a clean answer. The channel is not here to resolve it. The channel is here to tell you that both men were real, both contributions were real, and the game arrived in Brazil through more than one door. If you need a verdict, here it is, offered softly. Thomas Donohoe of Busby kicked a football in Brazil before the formal record begins. The record does not contradict this. What the record captures, clearly and precisely, is Charles Miller's match in 1895. One was the earliest seed we can find evidence of. The other was the first flower. Seeds and flowers are not in competition. They are part of the same growth. The Bangu kickabout and the Sao Paulo match are not rivals. They are chapters in the same early story. And the early story is not the important story. The important story is what Brazil grew from those beginnings, which is something extraordinary. But we will come to that. The warmth of that part is still ahead of us. For now, stay a moment longer in 1894, in Bangu, in the last light of the afternoon. The men are dispersing. The makeshift goals are already gone, the jackets reclaimed, the dust settling back into its usual indifference. Thomas Donohoe walks back toward the factory workers' housing. The ball is under his arm. Behind him, the factory is quiet now, the day shift finished, the vats cooling, the looms still. In a few days, he will write a letter home. We do not know what he said in it. We never will. Perhaps he mentioned the football. Perhaps he said it was strange to play in such heat, that the ground was hard and red, that some of the local men had watched and then joined in and shown no fear of the ball at all. Perhaps he said it felt almost like home, for an hour, almost like a Saturday in Busby. The letter, if he wrote it, is gone. The Clyde keeps its own counsel, as it always has. The rain comes in off the hills, and the river runs dark and fast, and does not explain itself. Somewhere in Busby there was a woman or a mother or a friend who read whatever Thomas sent and thought, well, he sounds well enough. And in Bangu, the ground where they played, it does not know it is the beginning of anything. It is just ground, red dust and dry grass and the long shadow of a factory chimney in the late afternoon. The same ground where, in a few years, more men will play, and then more, and eventually a club will form. That club will play in a league. The league will grow. The city will fall in love with the game, and then the country will fall in love with the game, and then the love will become something that does not have a name in any language, because no language had planned for it. But that is ahead. For now it is just ground, and a ball, and a man from Busby who did not know he was planting anything, only that he had an afternoon and a leather ball and enough flat space to play. Sometimes that is how the important things begin, quietly, without documents, without anyone writing it down at the time. The honest summary, then, as the afternoon closes in. Donohoe, Bangu around 1894, an informal beginning, an early seed, a working man's habit carried across an ocean, real and significant and imperfectly documented. Miller, Sao Paulo, 1895, the formal beginning, the recorded match, the organized foundation, real and significant and clearly attested. Both belong to this story. Neither erases the other. The debate is a sign of how much both beginnings matter, not a sign that one of them must be discarded. Football history in Brazil is rich enough to hold two founding stories, two cities, two men, and the honest uncertainty that connects them. What the channel holds, and what we offer to you in this quiet hour, is this: a dyer from Busby carried a ball to Brazil. The records suggest he kicked it on a flat piece of ground in Bangu around 1894. That is a remarkable thing. It does not need to be more than it is to be worth telling. The ball is still, the dust has settled, the afternoon is over. Somewhere south in Sao Paulo, a young man named Charles Miller is preparing for something more formal, something that will be written down. The game is finding its feet in this enormous, sun-warmed country. Two cities, two beginnings, one extraordinary future. Sleep now is somewhere ahead of us. But first, in the next chapter, we will watch the game take root through the factory clubs, through the working communities, through the Brazilian men and women who took this foreign thing and began quietly and with great seriousness, to make it entirely their own. The factory that started it all does not close when the whistle blows. Football, once it arrives in a place like Bangu, does not stay in one corner. The men who work the looms and the vats carry it home in their legs, in the way they walk, in the arguments they have over a game replayed in the mind on the long walk back through the red dust to their doors. Bangu Athletic Club takes shape officially in April 1904. The founding roll call reads like the factory floor itself: English names, Italian names, Portuguese names, Brazilian names. That mix is not sentiment. It is simply who is available. The factory needs enough players for two sides, and the factory does not have enough Englishmen to fill them. This is where something quietly important begins. The elite clubs of Rio and Sao Paulo are building strict walls around their membership. Class, education, the right address. The factory at Bangu is not interested in those walls. It needs footballers, and so it finds them. In 1905, Francisco Carregal pulls on a Bangu shirt. He is a Rio-born man, the son of a Portuguese father and a black Brazilian mother. When he takes the pitch, the records suggest he is the first black Brazilian to play for a formal club in the country, not because Bangu is idealistic, because Bangu is practical, and in that practicality, something genuinely radical quietly happens. The Metropolitan League of Rio does not see it that way. In 1907, the league moves to bar black athletes from its competitions. Bangu withdraws from the entity entirely. That decision does not get the fanfare it deserves, but it is worth holding for a moment. A factory football club in 1907 walks away from the league rather than walks away from its player. Francisco Carregal plays 28 matches for Bangu. He scores 6 goals. The record is exact. He is not a footnote. He is a founding figure in a story about who Brazilian football truly belongs to, a question the country will spend the next century finding its answer to. The ground the game travels along is mostly iron. Brazil's railways, laid down through the second half of the 19th century, are largely a British project. Scots and English engineers supervise the line from Santos up to Sao Paulo. They oversee the grades and the cuttings and the embankments through scrubland and forest. They bring, almost without thinking, the things they do on a Saturday afternoon. The Sao Paulo Railway Company has its own team. The Sao Paulo Gas Company has its own team. The match between those two sides on a flat stretch of ground near the city in April 1895 is the one Charles Miller helps organize and is the one historians most often call the first documented formal match in Brazil. The record is clear on that. The factory at Bangu follows a different path, earlier and less formal, and both paths matter. Along the docks at Santos, the largest coffee port in the world, men from Clydeside and Tyneside oversee the winches and the warehouses. They bring the game to the waterfront. Along the gas mains and the telegraph lines that run out from the cities into the interior, British foremen carry a ball the way other men carry a Bible, not as a mission, just as themselves. The game spreads the way infrastructure spreads, along the lines of work and necessity. A railway camp becomes a pitch at the weekend. A dockside clearing becomes a pitch. A patch of flat ground beside a gasworks becomes a pitch. The ball is improvised sometimes, a tight bundle of rags, and the goals are stones or posts cut from nearby trees. None of that diminishes the seriousness of the game. In the industrial belt around Sao Paulo, the flat ground alongside the rivers becomes the natural home of amateur football. The Brazilian word for these waterside meadows is várzea, and the football played on them begins to be called futebol de várzea. It is not a league. It is not a tournament with a silver cup. It is just football played on whatever ground lies available for the simple pleasure of the game. Thousands of these clubs form in the industrial districts of Sao Paulo and Rio in the first decades of the new century. They have no permanent grounds. They have no stands. They have shirts that do not always match. They have players who work the machines by day and play on the floodplain by the last light of the evening. They are the real engine of what is coming. Back in Bangu, the textile workers are finishing the afternoon shift. The looms slow, the shuttles stop. The red dust settles on the windowsills. The men file out into the falling light, and the ones who are not too tired walk to the flat ground behind the factory. The ball is already there. This happens not once, but week after week, season after season, until it becomes something that does not need an occasion. The factory clubs are doing something the formal leagues are slow to do. They are mixing people, not as a philosophy, but as a fact of the working day. When the whistle goes, the man who set the loom works beside the man who drove the belt, and both of them walk off the pitch with the same red dust on their boots. The pitch levels what the office does not. This is what Thomas Donohoe brought from Busby in his bag, along with the cotton samples. Not a final, not a formal association, not a set of rules handed down from a committee. A game. A simple, portable, irreducible game that could be played on any level ground by anyone willing to learn the shape of it. The shape of it in these early factory years is still recognizably Scottish and English. Short passing where the ground allows, long-hoofed clearances when it does not. The leather ball heavy when it rains, which it does in Rio and Sao Paulo with a thoroughness that a Glaswegian would find almost familiar. The game is foreign here, but only just. The climate takes care of everything else. By 1910, something has shifted. It is not a single moment. There is no date to record it. But the game that is being played on the várzea pitches and the factory grounds is not quite the same game that arrived in the bag from Southampton. It is faster in short spaces. There is more use of the instep. There is a willingness to beat a man rather than play around him that the original rulebook does not quite account for. The children of the men who first watched the British workers play are now playing themselves. They grew up beside the pitch. They learned the game not from a book, but from watching and then joining in when the numbers were short and no one thought to stop them. They did not inherit the rules so much as they inherited the pleasure of it, and that is a different thing. Chapter 5. The beach changes everything, not all at once, and not by design, but along the flat sands of Rio, where the city runs down to the Atlantic, and the light on the water in the early morning is white and sharp. Children play a version of the game that has no keeper and few rules, and a great deal of invention. The soft sand teaches the foot to cradle the ball differently. A hard pass into soft ground stops dead. So the touch must be lighter, the control more deliberate, the next move thought about before the ball arrives. Nobody designs this as a training method. The beach is simply where the children happen to be, and the ball happens to be there too. On the street corners of Rio and Sao Paulo, the game shrinks to fit the space available. A narrow lane between two rows of houses becomes a pitch 60 feet long. The goals are a pair of sandals laid flat. The rules are negotiated before every game and revised during it. The skills that survive this environment are specific ones: close control, quick turns, the ability to keep the ball in a very small area of the world. Nobody is recording this. There is no federation governing the street game, no newspaper correspondent watching the lane between the houses. The records only catch what happens in official matches on measured pitches. But the street and the beach are where the transformation is being made, game by game, in the afternoon heat, by children who have no idea they are doing anything significant. There is a word the Brazilians find for the particular lightness of their game, ginga. It is not easily translated. It is the sway, the shift of weight, the suggestion of one direction before the commitment to another. It comes from the body before it comes from the mind. The coaches of the elite clubs in Rio cannot quite teach it. The street, it seems, already has. The workers' game and the street game and the beach game are all different games, but they feed the same river. By the 1920s, that river is running fast. Brazil is beginning to produce players who are not playing a foreign game with Brazilian names. They are playing a Brazilian game that happens to use the same ball and the same goals and the same duration as the one that arrived from Scotland and England a generation before. The handover is gentle. There is no announcement. The Scottish and English engineers and foremen and textile workers are still in the country, some of them. Their sons sometimes play, but the game no longer needs them to carry it. It is being carried by millions of people who have made it into something that, in its expression, its texture, its genius for improvisation, belongs to Brazil entirely. The elite clubs resist this for a while. Fluminense puts rice powder on the faces of black players to lighten their complexion for official photographs. The story is well documented and it is painful. The longer arc bends against that. By the 1930s, black and mixed-race players are no longer only at the bangus of the game. They are at the center of it. The story of how that happened is Brazil's own to tell. What is not in dispute is that when the game finally opens up, Brazil does something the world has not seen before. It does not simply absorb the game, it transforms it. The technical vocabulary that comes from Europe is there, but the accent is entirely new. The weight of pass, the angle of run, the decision to hold rather than release, to flick rather than drive. None of that comes from a coaching manual. It comes from the várzea, from the beach, from the narrow lane between the houses, from the factory ground at Bangu where the looms fell silent on a Saturday afternoon and the men went out into the red dust to play. The chain runs from there to here without a break. This is what a game can do when it leaves one place and arrives in another with enough space to become something new. It does not stay the same. It cannot stay the same. A game played in a different climate, on different ground, by people with a different relationship to the body and to time, will become a different game. That is not loss. That is the whole point. Thomas Donohoe is back in Busby by the time any of this is visible. He works the rest of his life in textiles. He has his family. He has his Clyde and his reign. He does not leave a memoir. He does not claim a title. The records suggest he brought a ball to Bangu and organized a kickabout, and that is enough, more than enough. The stone that starts a river is not the river. What he set in motion, if we are honest, he could not have imagined. Not the Maracana, not the yellow shirt and the blue shorts and the green of the badge. Not the players who would come from that country and be spoken of in the same breath as any artist who ever worked in any medium at the highest level of their form. He could not have seen any of that from the hill at Busby. But this is the thing about carrying a game to a new place. You do not carry the destination. You only carry the beginning. The rest belongs to the people who receive it and what they choose to do with it and what they add from their own life and their own ground and their own genius. Brazil took the beginning and found an end that Scotland could never have written for it. The two football nations are still in conversation. They have met on the largest stages the game provides. They have shared coaches and players and ideas across the decades. When Scotland and Brazil play, there is something in it beyond the match itself. A recognition, maybe, a long remembering. Two countries who loved the game early and deeply, looking at each other across the pitch. That conversation started in a textile factory in the western suburbs of Rio de Janeiro, sometime around 1894. A man from Busby, his hands still carrying the knowledge of cotton and dye, placed a ball on the ground and invited the men around him to play. The grass was dry. The light was strong. The Atlantic was close enough to smell on the air. They played, and that was enough to start everything. Settle now, the factory is quiet. The pitch is empty in the evening light. The ball sits still on the red ground at Bangu, and the players have gone home to their suppers, and the city is cooling towards night. Somewhere far to the north, the Clyde is dark and wide under its own sky. Two rivers, neither knowing the other, running toward the same sea. Brazil did not receive football and simply repeat it. Brazil received a game and reinvented it. Something happened on those pitches that no rulebook had anticipated. The game became more fluid, more inventive, more alive with individual expression than anywhere else on earth. The reasons run deep into Brazilian culture. The way capoeira had trained bodies to move in spirals. The way the street demanded improvisation because the street was the pitch, because the pitch was wherever you found space. Football became something you felt before you thought. In Scotland, the game had always lived in a different register. Precise, collective, the pass as the heart of everything. The idea, radical in the 1870s, that the ball could travel faster than any man. That football was an argument between 11 minds, not a test of 11 bodies. These two instincts look different on the surface, but hold them together for a moment and something becomes clear. Both are about intelligence, both are about joy. The Scottish passing game and the Brazilian samba game are not opposites, they are cousins. One speaks in geometry, the other speaks in music, but both are saying the same thing: football at its best is not work. It is play in the truest sense, where the mind and the body solve problems together, and the solution is beautiful to watch. Scotland sent the game south with that idea already built into it. A ball is a gift, not a weapon. Move it, share it, find the space your teammate has already imagined. Brazil understood that immediately and then, over generations, deepened it into something the world had never seen before. The great Brazilian sides of the 20th century did not spring from nowhere. They were fed by decades of clubs and factories and street pitches and children who played until the light was gone and then played a little longer. Thomas Donohoe's ball found fertile ground. By the 1950s, Brazil was winning World Cups. By the 1960s, the word for what they played was no longer football. It was jogo bonito, the beautiful game, a phrase that would travel back around the world, back to the country that had first imagined football could be beautiful. Scotland never dominated the world stage in the same way. It was not that kind of story. Scotland was the inventor's story, the teacher's story, the country that gave the idea to everyone else and watched it grow into something larger than any single nation could claim. There is no bitterness in that, or there ought not to be. The teacher who watches a pupil surpass them has not failed. They have succeeded in the deepest way possible. The thing they loved, it turned out, was bigger than they knew. Scottish football kept its own flame lit. It kept faith with the passing tradition, with the idea that the game lives in the space between players, not only in the player on the ball. On wet midweek pitches in towns across the Central Belt, that idea is still played out every week. The crowds are smaller than in Brazil. The weather is unambiguously worse. The nights draw in earlier and the pitches cut up faster. None of that changes what the game is in the heart of the person playing it. The same concentration, the same satisfaction when the pass arrives exactly where the foot expected it. Football carries its own memory. Every player on every pitch is unconsciously repeating a pattern of thought that was worked out somewhere else, at some earlier time, by people whose names they will never know. The game is a kind of inheritance. And across that inheritance, Scotland and Brazil are connected, not just by Thomas Donohoe's kit bag and his crossing of the Atlantic in 1894, connected by a shared philosophy arrived at independently, confirmed by a century of play. The Scots invented passing because they understood the game collectively. The Brazilians invented the dribble and the feint and the unexpected angle because they understood the game individually. In the greatest moments of football, these two understandings become one. A great piece of play contains both: the run into space that creates the pass that creates the run, the individual reading the collective intention, the collective creating the space the individual needs. It is a conversation. It is, in the oldest sense, a game. Brazil and Scotland have met on football pitches of their own over the years, on occasions history has recorded. Two nations who love the game standing across from each other with mutual recognition. Here is a country that also understands. Here is a country that also feels it. The records of those meetings are kept. The results are part of football's long ledger. What the results cannot record is the quieter acknowledgement between two footballing peoples who have always, at some level, been on the same side of an argument about what the game is for. It is for joy, that is the argument. It is not for efficiency or safety or the grinding out of points. It is for the moment when a sequence of play becomes briefly, unmistakably, something more than its parts. That moment is the reason. Both nations have always known it. The game spread from Scotland to Brazil and from Brazil to the world. By the time that spreading was complete, it had become impossible to trace which idea belonged to whom. The game belonged to everyone. The philosophers of the passing game and the philosophers of the Samba game had contributed chapters to the same book. In Brazilian football academies today, young players are taught to control, to move, to read the game before the ball arrives. In Scottish youth football, children learn to look up, to pass before they are pressed, to think a beat ahead of the ball. The lessons are not identical, but the spirit behind them is. Think first, trust your teammate, make the game simple, and the simple thing will sometimes become extraordinary. That is the inheritance. That is what passed, in one direction, across the Atlantic in the late 19th century, and then passed back, transformed, across the decades of the 20th. Thomas Donohoe did not know any of this when he folded his football kit into a bag beside his cotton samples. He was a dyer from Busby, heading to a new job. He brought what he loved because that is what people do. You carry the thing you love when you travel. He could not have imagined what would grow from it. No one could have. The history of football is full of moments where a small act planted something enormous. A man carries a ball. A generation later, a country is playing football in a way the world has never seen. The chain of cause and effect is real, but no individual link knew what chain it was part of. That is perhaps the loveliest thing about it. The story of football in Brazil is not a story of grand intentions. It is a story of ordinary people who loved a game and shared it because they loved it. The factory workers of Bangu, the Scottish dyers who taught them, the Brazilian players who transformed what they were taught. Each of them was just playing. Each of them was just playing, and something permanent was being made. Now the wind slows. The long story has been told. What is left is the quiet that comes after telling. The dye works at Busby are gone. The buildings where men like Thomas Donohoe worked the vats and breathed the sharp steam have been replaced by grass, by silence, by the particular vacancy that industrial places leave when the industry departs. Stand in Busby on a still day and there is no visible trace. The river runs as it always ran. The fields are green in the way of west of Scotland fields, which is to say very green, with a quality of light that seems always slightly overcast even in summer. There is nothing to see. But the absence is its own kind of presence. Something happened here, something left here, crossed the world, and became something vast. The grass growing over the old foundations does not erase that. It only makes it quieter. In Bangu, on the western edge of Rio de Janeiro, the old factory still stands in some form. The walls have weathered through 130 years of tropical rain and heat. Paint has come and gone in layers. The building has taken on the color of time itself. The neighborhood around it is nothing like it was in 1894. The city has grown and changed and grown again. But the streets where factory workers once walked to a kickabout after their shift still exist as streets, as places where people live and move and carry the ordinary business of their days. Evening comes to Bangu as it comes to all of Rio, with a warmth in the light that turns the walls amber and then slowly dims to grey. In that evening light, the old walls ask nothing of anyone. They simply stand, as walls do, holding the memory of what happened within their sight. Somewhere in this city, in 1,000 different places, a leather ball sits on a rooftop terrace, left there after a game that finished at dusk. The ball has found a slight dip in the concrete, and it rests there still, as a ball at rest is perfectly still, as a sphere at rest is one of the most peaceful shapes in the world. The city goes on below it. The lights come on in windows. The last of the daylight leaves the sky. The ball sits there in the cooling air, doing nothing, being nothing except what it is, the thing that carries the game from one pair of hands to the next. Half a world from Rio, on a touchline somewhere in the Clyde Valley, another ball sits in wet grass. The pitch is empty now. The game ended an hour ago. Somebody left the ball behind, or left it on purpose, or simply forgot it in the business of getting changed and going home. The rain has started, the way it starts in Scotland, without announcement, with a kind of inevitability. The ball takes on a faint gleam in the low light. The painted touchline beside it is blurring slightly in the wet. The goal posts at the far end of the pitch are perfectly still. The grass is the deep, damp green of a Scottish evening. A crow has landed near the corner flag and is paying no attention to the ball or to anything in particular. The rain continues, gentle and steady, the way Scottish rain often is, as if it had always been raining and always would be. 2 balls, 2 countries, 1 game. The same dream crossed at the Atlantic, carried in a kit bag, grown into something neither country could have imagined alone. The ball in Rio and the ball in Scotland share a language, the same weight in the hand, the same feel off the instep, the same small flight through the air, the same brief moment of suspension before it drops. The physics are identical. The love that sent them traveling is identical. It began with a man from Busby who wanted to play football on a Saturday afternoon. It became the game of a nation. Then it became the game of a planet. Every thread in that long cloth was pulled by someone who simply loved the game enough to share it. Let that sit for a moment before sleep, the plainness of it, the loveliness of it. A Scotsman packed a ball, a Brazilian kicked it back. The world watched and learned from both of them. The dye works are grass now. The factory walls stand in the amber light. The balls are at rest in 2 hemispheres, holding the same shape, holding the same quiet promise. There is no need to carry any of this further tonight. The story is complete. The game is at rest. Let the rain fall on the touchline and the dusk fall on the rooftop. Let the walls of Bangu settle into the evening and the fields of Busby hold their gentle silence. The world is still. Football is still. The connection between two nations and a single leather ball is held in the long memory of the game itself, where it will remain unhurried for as long as people play. Rest now. The story has been told from beginning to end, from the dye vats of the Clyde to the factory yards of Rio, from an informal kickabout in the 1890s to the Jogo Bonito that would one day move the whole world. It is a good story. It deserves to settle quietly. Let your breath slow. Let the images go soft at the edges. The wet pitch in the Clyde Valley, the amber walls of Bangu, the two balls at rest, a world apart, dreaming of the same game. You have been listening to Tartan Lullaby. Tonight's story was Scotland and Brazil and the ball that travelled between them. There is more Scottish history waiting for you here, told slowly, told for sleeping, told for the long quiet hours between dusk and dawn. Good night. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. The story is finished, but the night isn't, so let this play on as long as it helps. If Tartan Lullaby has been good company, you're welcome to subscribe so the next story finds you. There's no rush. If you'd like to see the landscapes that go with these stories, the art prints are at Tartan Lullaby Art on Etsy, with mood boards and stills on Pinterest under the same name. The links are in the description below. Until next time, thank you for listening. Sleep well, all is well.